I never expected a Tuesday afternoon to feel like a confession. But there we were, me, pinned to a small folding chair in the corner of the repair shop's back office, and four women circling like they owned the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. My boss, calm and exacting as ever, leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and stared at me as though the day's engines weren't the only thing she was inspecting. Her sister, younger but with the same sharpness in her eyes, rested her hand lightly on the desk, a gesture that should have been casual, but it made me swallow hard. Then the two colleagues, smiles polite but eyes calculating, sat opposite me, tilting their heads like they were trying to figure out some unspoken riddle. "We're not done with you," my boss said. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't friendly either. The way it hung in the air, I could feel my chest tighten, my palms prickling with something I didn't yet understand. I glanced at her, mid-40s, poised, with a presence that filled the room without trying. She didn't need to smile to command attention, but when she did, it was a quick, almost imperceptible curve of lips that made me stumble inside. I wanted to tell myself it was absurd to feel nervous, yet my throat tightened, and I cleared it like she hadn't just made my pulse shift. The sister leaned forward, curiosity bright in her eyes. One of the colleagues passed me a folder. "Paperwork," she said, but her hand lingered over mine longer than necessary. I pulled it back, flustered, and their laughter was soft, teasing, enough to make my stomach roll with something unfamiliar. Then my boss did something small. She reached across the desk, quietly straightened a stray paper that had fallen over the edge. Her fingers brushed mine, accidental or maybe not, and I caught a faint scent, a subtle mix of jasmine and something warmer, grounding yet electric. I froze, too aware of how little I should be feeling, too aware of how long I wanted the moment to last. I kept looking at her, trying to read her expression, trying to figure out if that small kindness meant anything beyond politeness. Her eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and I felt it. An acknowledgement of something that didn't need to be said, a weight of years lived and choices made that somehow invited me in without explanation. The air between us was heavy with pauses, with unsaid words, with gestures that spoke louder than the sentences forming in the room. My heart felt too big for my chest, and I couldn't stop noticing how her sleeve brushed against the edge of the desk, how her posture shifted slightly, like she was leaning closer without moving an inch. That night, I kept replaying her voice in my head, like I missed something, or maybe wanted something. The hum of the fluorescent lights had settled into a kind of background pulse, but my own heart was too loud. I shouldn't have stayed past the end of my shift, but she had asked me to help with some old inventory she wanted sorted, and the way she said it, quiet, almost pleading, made it impossible to say no. I knew it was ridiculous. She was my boss. And yet, as I stacked boxes of worn manuals and parts, I found myself stealing glances at her, memorizing the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the curve of her neck as she bent to check a label, the subtle exhale she didn't realize she was letting slip. "You always notice the small things," she said softly, as though reading my thoughts. My chest thudded, and I looked up, startled. She had been watching me, not in a scrutinizing way, not sharply, but with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. There was a tremble in her fingers as she held a clipboard, and for a moment, she looked younger than her years, fragile in a way that made me ache. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, fumbling with a box that wasn't as heavy as it felt. Her eyes lingered on me, and I thought I saw a shadow pass across her face. A mix of fatigue and something I couldn't name. I wanted to reach out, to ease it, but I knew I shouldn't. And yet, every instinct in me was shouting to stay close, to lean into that quiet intimacy. A notebook slipped from the top of a shelf, and I caught it before it hit the floor. She brushed past me to retrieve a pen that had rolled under the table, and her arm grazed mine. A spark shot up my skin, and I jerked slightly, pretending it was just surprise. She looked at me, one corner of her mouth tipping up, and there it was again, That look that said maybe she noticed the effect she had on me, maybe she didn't care, or maybe she was testing me. "Stay a little longer," she said, almost as an afterthought, but her eyes held me. I nodded, my fingers tightening around the notebook. I wanted to tell her something, anything, but the words were trapped behind the very rules I was supposed to follow. I stayed, and I couldn't stop noticing her, not even for a second. I was stacking boxes near the corner when her voice stopped me. "Can you sit for a minute?" she asked, gesturing toward a battered chair by the office window. The sunlight cut through the dusty glass, painting her in streaks of gold and shadow. I hesitated. Sitting felt too intimate, but the vulnerability in her tone made my feet move before my brain could protest. She leaned back, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. For a moment, she was just a woman, not my boss, not the one I was supposed to keep a professional distance from. Her eyes flicked toward mine, hesitant, and I caught a tremor in her hand as she fiddled with the pen on her desk. I wanted to reach over and steady it, to brush away whatever weight she was carrying, but I knew I shouldn't. Then my phone buzzed. A text from a colleague downstairs, asking if I was still there. I glanced at it, trying to find a reason to leave, but she caught the movement. "Ignore that," she said softly, her hand brushing my arm in a fleeting, accidental, or maybe not gesture. My pulse spiked. I pulled back ever so slightly, pretending it was reflex, but the warmth lingered, a whisper against my skin. Her gaze followed me, intent and unspoken, and I realized she wasn't letting me go. There was something in the quiet that demanded attention, a fragile honesty that made it impossible to leave. I tried to focus on the paperwork stacked haphazardly beside me, but my eyes kept returning to her face, the subtle curve of her lips, the way her shoulders shifted as if waiting for a confession she might never hear. Then, out of nowhere, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt. A third party. Something to snap the spell. I exhaled, ready to pull myself back into the world of rules and safety. But even as I moved, her hand brushed mine again, lighter this time, almost teasing. I froze, caught between obligation and the strange gravity pulling me toward her. For a moment, we just sat there, eyes locking, silence thick between us, broken only by the distant hum of the workshop. I wanted to pull away, wanted to tell myself this was wrong. But my chest was too tight, my mind too aware of every subtle cue, every lingering look. And then she said, almost a whisper, "Don't go yet." I didn't. The office had grown quieter than usual, the hum of the workshop fading to a distant murmur. I was arranging files on the corner of her desk when she suddenly leaned forward, resting both elbows lightly against the surface, and looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten. Her eyes were no longer guarded. They were searching, exposing something that made me feel both terrified and unreasonably alive. "I don't know why I asked you to stay," she murmured, voice low, almost breaking. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone right now." The words weren't dramatic, but their weight pressed against me like a hand I couldn't shake. I wanted to respond, to tell her it was okay, that I felt the same, but my tongue felt suddenly heavy, betraying the racing thoughts in my head. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, and I noticed the subtle tremble in her fingers. My hand twitched, half-reached toward hers, and I caught myself, pulling it back like it had burned me. The tension was unbearable, raw and electric, as if every unspoken thing between us had condensed into that single shared moment. "Do you ever feel like things are just slipping through your fingers?" she asked, almost to herself. I hesitated, then nodded, unsure whether she meant life, work, or the strange gravity pulling us together. Her gaze softened, but it also held an edge of vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability mixed with longing, an impossible combination that made me ache. Then she laughed, quietly, nervously, a sound so human and flawed that it made me want to stay, to say something I shouldn't. I cleared my throat, feeling the burn of words I didn't have the courage to speak. Sometimes, I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I noticed things I probably shouldn't. My words hung between us, awkward, fragile, but she didn't pull away. She tilted her head, as if weighing whether I had just crossed some line or opened a door that neither of us was ready to close. The silence stretched. My chest ached. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, waiting for an answer that didn't exist yet. I wanted to tell her everything. How she made me feel, how impossible this was, how I couldn't stop thinking about her. But the rules, the fear, the world outside this tiny room, all of it pressed against me, holding me back. Finally, she leaned back, exhaling slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. And now, what do we do? I thought the tension between us had reached its peak. But then the office door creaked, and her sister stepped in, holding a small box with a mischievous grin. "Oh, I didn't expect you two to be talking," she said lightly, but there was an edge in her tone that made my stomach flip. My eyes darted to my boss, and I saw a flicker of something unguarded. Surprise, embarrassment, maybe regret. "Just sorting through some old stuff," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. I noticed her hand brush against the edge of the desk where mine had rested moments ago, the contact fleeting, loaded. I wanted to tell her to breathe, to let it go, but the words lodged in my throat. Her sister leaned closer, opening the box to reveal old photos and letters, and then froze mid-motion, scanning the images. My jaw tightened as I realized the contents weren't just any memorabilia. They were hers, a part of her life I hadn't known existed. My pulse spiked, not with anger, but with a sudden intimacy I hadn't anticipated. She bit her lip, caught between wanting to explain and wanting to let the moment pass. "I didn't know you knew about this," I said, voice low, more vulnerable than I intended. My words hung in the air. She looked at me, startled, then softened, her eyes reflecting a shadow of her younger self I hadn't seen before. There was honesty there, raw and unfiltered, the kind that made it impossible to pretend nothing had shifted. For a second, the workshop, the office, even the humming fluorescent lights faded. It was just her, just me, standing on the precipice of something neither of us had expected. I realized that the connection I'd felt, the pull, the attention, the unspoken weight of her presence, wasn't entirely new. Somewhere in the past, our lives had crossed paths I hadn't remembered until now. Her sister gave a small cough, breaking the spell, and I felt the rules of reality slam back into place. I glanced at her, searching for guidance, for a signal, for something to anchor me in this sudden revelation. She gave me a brief, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that said, "We both feel it," and then she whispered, barely audible over the ticking of the wall clock, "You never knew, but you always mattered more than you think." I froze, chest tight, mind spinning, caught between fear, longing, and the dangerous allure of what we might finally admit. The office felt smaller now, every shadow and sliver of light magnified. We were standing closer than before, but neither of us moved. I could feel the weight of the past, the pull of the present, and the fragile possibility of something neither of us dared name. "I can't stop thinking about you," I said finally, my voice rough, unsure, but honest. The words tasted strange, like something forbidden and necessary all at once. She didn't flinch. She just looked at me, her eyes soft but unwavering, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're too young," she whispered, a statement more than a warning. Yet the vulnerability behind it made my chest ache. I wanted to argue, to say it didn't matter, but instead, I stepped closer, careful not to invade, careful not to push too far. The line we'd danced around for weeks shimmered between us, fragile as a thread of light. Her hand hovered near mine, unsure, trembling just slightly. I reached out, letting our fingers brush, and she didn't pull away. That small contact held more meaning than any confession I could have spoken. It was acknowledgement, admission, and a promise rolled into one quiet, perfect gesture. "I don't care about the rules," I said, barely above a whisper. I don't want to pretend anymore." She looked at me then, really looked, and I thought I saw relief, surprise, and something deeper, acceptance, flicker in her gaze. We didn't rush. No dramatic gestures, no sudden kisses. Just a long, shared silence, punctuated by small breaths and the quiet hum of the office around us. It was human, flawed, real, the kind of moment you hold on to, even when the rest of the world presses in. Finally, she spoke, voice soft but steady. "Then, stay." I did. Not because it was easy, not because everything was perfect, but because it felt right. Because after all the hesitation, all the stolen glances, all the nearly confessions and missteps, this was the place where we both belonged, if only for this moment. And as we stood there, fingers barely touching, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. This connection, messy and improbable as it was, had already changed me. For the first time in a long while, the tension that had haunted me, the fear of crossing lines, the longing, the uncertainty, felt like possibility instead. And in that quiet, electric pause, I knew I would never forget her. The office had grown quiet, the day waning into late afternoon. Boxes were stacked, papers sorted, and yet none of it felt important anymore. What mattered was the space between us, finally acknowledged, finally held without pretense. She looked at me and smiled, a small, real smile that didn't hide the years, the regrets, or the walls she'd carefully built. "I don't think I've ever felt this," she admitted, voice low but steady. There was no need for embellishment. The words were enough. Enough to make the months of tension, the stolen glances, the near confessions, all make sense. I exhaled, letting the tightness in my chest loosen. "Me neither," I said simply, and it was the truest thing I could have said. We didn't need grand gestures or perfect timing. Just honesty, presence, and the fragile courage to admit what had been simmering beneath the surface. For the first time, I saw her fully. Not just as my boss, not just as the woman who had unervingly captivated me, but as someone human, layered, and alive. And she saw me, too, not as a younger man to be protected or guided, but as someone capable of holding a piece of her world carefully, tenderly. We didn't rush into anything. The tension didn't dissolve like magic, but there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable, in the way we shared the room, the way we exchanged looks, and even the way our hands occasionally brushed in passing. It was the start of something new, fragile but real. And as I finally left the office, stepping into the hum of the workshop and the golden light of late afternoon, I realized how much I had changed. The fear, the obsession, the longing, they hadn't vanished, but they had transformed into awareness, patience, and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, some boundaries could bend without breaking everything. That night, I replayed our final moments again and again in my head, smiling at her small gestures, at the electric pause that had finally been honored. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't need them. What mattered was the beginning, the acknowledgement, and the courage to feel what we had been holding back. So, what about you, the one reading this? Did you enjoy the story? Would you like to see more slow-burn, impossible connections like this one? Or maybe something unexpected, messy, and human? I want to hear what kind of stories make your heart skip a beat.